Welcome to the lair of the Batty Boffin.
Hello Batty fans, welcome to part 2 of the videos about the water cycle. Now in part 1 I asked you a few questions, and if you haven't watched that video go back and have a think about them. In this part here we're going to talk about some of the answers. The first question I asked was all about clouds. Clouds, where do they get their water from? Well, here's what. Clouds are made of some stuff called water vapour. That's water in a gaseous state. It's not the same as steam. Steam and water vapour are very different things, although we often use the word steam when we actually mean water vapour. The stuff that comes off the top of a cup of coffee, we often call it steam. It's not, it's water vapour. If it was steam, it would burn you. Don't put your hand in it. Top of a kettle, that cloudy stuff you can see coming off, that's water vapour. There may also be steam coming off a kettle as well, but steam is invisible and it'll burn, so don't put your hand anywhere near it. Basically, if you can see it and it's that white cloudy stuff, it's water vapour. It's the same stuff that comes out of your mouth when you breathe. It's the same stuff as mist and fog and clouds. All the same stuff, water vapour. Also, it's incidentally the same stuff that comes out of the back of aeroplanes. Those lines you can see across the sky, contrails are sometimes called, condensation trails. It's not smoke, it's water vapour. Same stuff, long thin clouds. So, clouds are made of stuff called water vapour, which is basically tiny, tiny little droplets of water. So small they kind of float in the air. When they get enough of them close together, they'll squish together and make bigger droplets, and when those droplets get big enough, they turn into rain. Or it could be snow or hail or whatever. Okay, so clouds are made of water vapour. That water runs down onto the sea and onto the land. When it hits the land, some of it will run off the surface of the land and it goes into drains and eventually it ends up in streams and rivers. Some of it will soak into the land, and that's the clue to the next question. I asked you where streams and rivers get their water from when it hasn't been raining for a while. Obviously if it's just been raining, then that water goes into the rivers, and over the next few days it all gets washed away. But if it hasn't been raining for a while, the rivers and streams still keep going. That's because they're getting their water from rain that's soaked into the ground. It could be last week, last month, last year. It could be 10 years ago. It could even be like 100 or 200 years ago. Some water takes a very long time to get through. So what happens, the water comes into the land and soaks in, not just to the soil, but into the rocks underneath it. And it's a little bit like a sponge in the bathroom. If you have a sponge in the bathroom and it's wet, the top of the sponge is actually quite dry and the water sinks down to the bottom, so you've got a soggy bit of sponge at the bottom. Well, the rocks are the same. There's a level called the water table. About here, and below here, the rocks are soggy, they've got water in them. So, here's the answer to some of the other questions. If you get a crack in the rocks at the water table level, sometimes that crack will have water that flows out of it, and that's what forms a spring. A spring is a baby river where a river's born. And they just flow out of cracks in the rock if that rock happens to be carrying water. And that will gather together more bits of water. We've got little tributaries coming in here. It gets bigger and bigger and bigger till it flows out to the sea. So that's how rivers keep flowing even when it hasn't been raining for a while. The river is carrying water that's soaked into that rocks. It might have been 200 years ago, because it takes a long time to go through some of the rock. It also explained how wells work. If you dig a hole down far enough, if you dig down through the rocks until you get to the water table, when you dig down to below the water table, water will flow in and fill that hole, and that's how wells work. And that's how wells can still keep going even when it hasn't been raining. Now if it doesn't rain for a very long time, the water table will actually drop slightly, and if it drops to below the bottom of your well, then you won't have any water. You need to dig your well down a bit further to get down into the water table again. So that's how wells and springs work. And the next question I asked was, these rivers carrying fresh water flow into the sea. But the sea's salty. Where did it get its salt from? Well, that's also explained by the springs. The springs carry water that's come through the rocks. And you might have heard the phrase, as well as spring water, mineral water. It's actually all the same stuff. Mineral water or spring water is water that's been bottled from the spring, and it's just come out through the rocks. And as it travels through the rocks, it dissolves tiny little amounts of that rock. And small amounts of dissolved rock we call minerals. And a lot of them might be very good for you. They may contain calcium, for example, very good for your teeth and bones. So mineral water is very healthy stuff. But those minerals actually comprise part of the salts that are in the sea. Salt in the sea isn't just sodium chloride, there's lots of other things in there as well. But those salts come from the minerals dissolved in the rocks over hundreds of years while that rainwater's been filtering down through the rocks. In some places, the springs come up with so heavy in minerals that you can actually taste it. And there are some famous places like, for example, Bath and Matlock Bath in Derbyshire that have famous springs. Sometimes they're even warm, and people bath in them, hence the name Bath and Matlock Bath. And sometimes the mineral water is so laden in minerals that it tastes really horrible. And so people at the time often thought it tastes so bad it must therefore be really good for you, so they glugged it down in vast quantities. It probably is quite good for you, lots of good minerals in there as well, and no doubt some good healthy bacteria too. So there's all your water with minerals in it flowing into the sea, and that's how come the salt gets into the sea. But of course you can't taste it in the fresh water, and you can in the sea. So how come that? Well, that's the same answer as the answer to the question of how come the seas haven't filled up. All of this water's flowing in. Where's it going to? Well, it's not flowing anywhere. It's evaporating. As the sun shines on the sea, some of the water gets warm enough that little molecules pop off and they become water vapour, and it evaporates from the surface of the sea. You've seen evaporation before, it happens on the sea too, just you don't notice it quite so much because there's a lot of it there. So the water vapour evaporates up, goes into the air's full of water vapour anyway, there's a bit more water vapour for you, but enough of that water vapour gathers together, it forms clouds, and we're back to where we started again. So this is why it's called the water cycle. We have got evaporation, sending water vapour into the air. That water vapour forms clouds, which come down onto the land, soak through the rocks, come out as springs, down the rivers, into the sea, and back again, all the way round. The water cycle.
Mwahaha! Mwahaha! Mwahaha!